Welcome back. More than 1 million people have fled their homes across South Sudan since fighting erupted last December. Thousands have been killed in a conflict that started as a political dispute between President Salva Kiir and his Vice President Riek Machar. But the biggest threat to the people could be food shortages. Joining us now from San Diego is author and filmmaker Robert Young Pelton. In February, he and his team traveled to South Sudan to document the civil war. And joining us from Nairobi is John Gachie. He's a media consultant and foreign and security policy analyst. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for joining us. Robert, let me start with you. As I just mentioned, you traveled to South Sudan to document the conflict there. You produced the documentary Saving South Sudan. Let's watch a portion of that, and then I have a question.
We wanted reform. I said I was going to contest presidential elections. But because he knew he was going to lose the presidential elections, he created this conflict.
No matter what the differences were going to be or the issues, in my mind, they would be addressed through dialogue, through democratic processes, not this.
The wrath of Salva Kiir is now being expressed on the ground.
It's a country in crisis. Serious crisis. And that's why I was saying I'm hopeful that we will, and I'm confident, because if we don't move upwards and we move downward, it would be worse than Somalia.
So, Robert, there you were interviewing the opposition leader, Riek Machar, and his wife, Angelina. Let me ask you first, what were your impressions of the conflict there, and particularly of Riek Machar?
Well, Riek Machar is a very eloquent, educated man, but beneath that surface is a very, very violent war. We were the first to film the White Army in combat, which is quite horrific. I mean, you're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of youths with spears, machetes, weapons, attacking en masse, raping, killing, and looting. So even though South Sudan has the veneer of a new country, it's actually a very, very primitive and violent place out in the country.
John, in Nairobi, what is the status of the civil war right now? What is driving it?
It's quite clear. It's personal ambitions, in particular, as perhaps the other guest has said, we have warlords, and they have this veneer of being democratic and fairly sophisticated, but they are deep down basically warlords that seek to a political ambition, power, and an ambition. And it's a tragedy that what we have in South Sudan now is a vicious power struggle between various factions, regardless of their claims to seeking democratic change and, shall I say, development. It's a tragedy that the people of South Sudan have to make do with very, very ambitious people who want to then take power with all means available, regardless.
Robert, when you went to make the documentary in South Sudan, you took a team down. One of the members of that team was Machar. He's a former lost boy. These were the young people who came to America to escape the violence in Sudan. I want to play another excerpt from Saving South Sudan. Let's watch this.
For now, people could hunt because the animals came to the water. They could fish because the rivers were low. But in a few weeks, as the wet season approaches, this would all change. Machar had seen all this before. He was here when the Nuer were starving. He was a child soldier fighting an ugly war with his brothers, the Dinka. He didn't want to think about that now. He had come here to save South Sudan.
Well, you've been living in Seattle, you know, you go to McDonald's, and now you come here. But these are your people, and this is where you're from. Do you feel like you're part of this, or do you feel like you're part of that?
Well, I feel in between. You know, I see my people dying with nothing to eat. This is just not good. I don't even feel like, you know, going back because I know it will be in my mind every day.
So, Robert, what was that like working with Machar? I mean, I understand that there was a great deal of enthusiasm when he first joined the team and you went off to South Sudan, but that quickly faded.
Well, you have to understand that the people of South Sudan have been fighting a war for many, many decades, and they're very proud, they're very industrious, and they constantly try to overcome these obstacles to peace. There's been many referendums, there's been many bouts of both fighting and peacetime, so they all work together, but when he got there, he saw such chaos and such violence that I wouldn't say he gave up, but he realized that this was much, much bigger. Essentially what had happened is the Western groups had created a government with one political party, so there was no escape valve. If somebody disagreed with someone, they would simply fire them and replace them with someone from their own tribe. So President Salva Kiir had essentially stacked the entire party with his cronies. And then there's the issues of corruption and, of course, poverty and the lack of roads and development. So it's an extraordinary challenge.
Right, and John, you mentioned earlier on that, a lot of the war is being driven by warlords in the country. To what extent does oil have to do with this? Is this a fight over oil?
That's the crux of the matter. But perhaps let's look at it this way, that for the groups that are fighting, I like to call them the pension brigade. And I use this very advisedly, because what we have in South Sudan is a government, yes, that was elected, yes. However, the security sector is composed of various factions that owe their allegiance to different warlords. Now, in this regard, oil indeed is a critical issue, but the South Sudan, as we know it, we never sought about security sector reforms. We never sought about disarming, demobilizing, and then reforming the security sector as you were doing with the political sector. So when the political class failed to agree, or there was a division, they all went back to their militia groups to effect and force a political settlement. So what you're seeing right now is a government that is in power, of course. However, it's the military security apparatus is split right down the middle. And we've had over the last 7 months, basically the entire security sector, the military, the police, and everything has collapsed, and they've all gone back to the former warlords, and they are effecting that. So until and unless we address the political, then the security sector, the demobilization, the reintegration, and disarmament, then we will still have this issue coming in. For me, it reminds me possibly of the big tragedy we had in Africa, that was Angola, and oil resources, where the control of these resources and the political largesse and patronage networks were still beholden to this. Now, what the other countries in the region, possibly even the larger international players on the energy field, are really interested in having a share. And all this really makes it a very murky world, and we have to address those issues at the moment.
Right. Robert, as we heard there, John saying that the military is split down the middle, they're going after the same resource, which is oil. Did you experience that firsthand? I mean, what kind of dangers did you face in making this documentary as you traveled around the country?
Well, I wasn't concerned about the dangers. I've been in combat for many, many years in many, many countries. I was more concerned about helping people understand the dynamics behind the meltdown of the world's newest country. I wanted to say this about oil. Oil has been a curse for South Sudan. It is a singular source of income that flows directly to the top, not to the bottom. And it is part of a symbiotic relationship with Sudan proper, in which they have to pay essentially a $35 per barrel tax. What happened is that South Sudan got a little too tricky and decided they were going to revert that oil southward, and brought in people like Eric Prince of Blackwater to build refineries, which makes sense on paper, but they anger Sudan, who obviously needs the income from that oil. What we're seeing now is a complete lack of interest in South Sudan, because it is the world's worst humanitarian disaster right now in terms of civilian starvation, but it's been superseded by events in the Ukraine, Syria, Gaza, Israel, et cetera, et cetera. It is quite sad to see so many civilians left destitute and hungry. So I would encourage people to look at the statistics about the number of civilians that are left hungry.
John, what do we know about international efforts to resolve this crisis? The African Union has been involved, and the UN has a peacekeeping force in there as well.
Yes, it's rather a tragedy that the international community, and in particular the African Union and also the regional body, what we call the IGAD, they've all been kind of sucked in, and they're kind of in a bind. They do not at the moment have the sufficient political, economic, and possibly even military leverage to bring the warring groups at least to the table. The tragedy is that a lot of the countries in the region, Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Sudan, they all have vested interest in this conflict. And they are all playing, in my view, they are all playing a double game, in particular Sudan and possibly Ethiopia. Uganda has deliberately made its position known. Perhaps it is reviewing it. It's willing perhaps to probe and push Salva Kiir more to the table. But Ethiopia and Sudan are still wobbly and trying to assess their direct security and military interest. For Kenya, Kenya is caught in a bind at the moment. So we find that the African Union perhaps had laid too much emphasis on the regional intervention, and the countries in the region are quite caught up. And unless they are able to redefine their strategic, political, and military interests right now, as the other guest is saying, we are facing a veritable catastrophe of enormous, shall I say, pain. And I think the ramification will be felt immediately in Kenya, Uganda, and South Sudan, and Ethiopia. That's a tragedy. That it's something that is going to explode unless. Yep.
Okay. Robert, was that your impression as well, that this is heading for a catastrophe here, or were you hopeful after traveling to the country and talking to people there that there might be a resolution on the horizon?
Well, one of the interesting things about the people in South Sudan is that a large percentage of the people outside of the urban areas are pastoralists. In other words, they live off the land. They have their cattle. They go where the water goes. They fish. They hunt, as I point out in the documentary on Vice. If they are left to their own devices, meaning no interference from the government, they actually can survive. But when they're forced into refugee camps by ethnic cleansing and violence, and when other nations lend their troops and high-tech military tools to kill these people and drive them away from their natural lands, then you have this horrible side effect of social engineering. And particularly with the country of Uganda, who is sort of in bed with the president of South Sudan, Salva Kiir, there's also a lot of corruption and cronyism going on that skews what should be a sort of an egalitarian African Union or international response to these crises. So I think left alone to their own devices, they do fine. But when we try to socially engineer these areas, we create disaster.
John, what kind of pressure is there coming from, if any, if they're coming from the wider international community for these South Sudanese leaders to resolve the conflict?
There is some pressure, but I don't think it's sufficient. In my view, I think there is need to be more targeted and personal accountable sanctions. And I think from what we are hearing from the European Union, from the US, they are, in my view, too little, too late for what is likely to happen. Because I think both parties, at least Salva Kiir, the president, and Riek Machar, they are all hoping, and they are arming, and they are recruiting, and they are hoping that they can force the other side to a deal through the force of military success on the ground. And unless then the leverage, and I would say very targeted, individual and personal accountability sanctions from the US, from the United Nations. Perhaps we are hearing there will be a UN Security Council a team coming over sometimes in September, and we are hoping we need to see more action and more direct and effective sanctions. And the same applies to the region. IGAD, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Sudan of those three countries, if they were really going to put their money where their mouths are, I think we could force the groups to up to a more, shall I say, successful negotiation. But what we are seeing now, they are all playing up and about, you know, and we are not seeing as a forceful engagement as we would have liked.
Okay, John Gachie, Robert Young Pelton, thanks to both of you for joining us.